My name is Thea, and I'm 31 years old. 3 days before my wedding, I read a text from my mother while sitting on my bathroom floor in my dress during the final fitting. My brother Desmond's business trip to Singapore mattered more than what she called my little party. She and my father had already booked flights to see him off instead of attending my ceremony. My father, who had promised for over a year to walk me down the aisle, added a thumbs-up emoji to her message, as if that settled it. I spent 14 months planning that wedding on a budget I built myself, waiting tables and taking freelance design gigs at night so I wouldn't have to ask my parents for $1. I wanted one day, untouched by the favoritism that had shaped every family gathering since I was a teenager. Growing up, Desmond got the trophies on the mantle and a college fund that never ran dry. I got a scholarship I earned entirely on my own, and my mother's response was to ask why I hadn't applied somewhere with better name recognition. I learned early that competing for their attention was pointless, so I stopped and built a life that didn't depend on their approval. I met my fiancé Rowan 2 years ago at a pottery class. He proposed on the hiking trail, where we'd had our first real conversation about what we both wanted out of life. Planning our wedding was the first time I'd ever felt like a priority to anyone, which made my parents' text cut even deeper. By the morning of the wedding, they were already boarding a flight to Singapore. I found out through a photo my aunt sent, my parents grinning in an airport lounge, my brother between them holding a boarding pass like a prize. 4 hours before the ceremony, and no one to walk me down the aisle. My coordinator, a steady woman named Odalise, saw me go pale and didn't offer pity. She offered a solution. The venue's landscape architect, a widower named Julian Thorne, had been overseeing the garden restoration for weeks and had mentioned more than once how impressive my planning had been. She asked if I wanted her to see whether he'd step in. I laughed at first, but desperation and dignity make strange bedfellows, and within the hour, I was sitting across from Julian in the greenhouse, watching him listen to my situation with real seriousness. He said yes without hesitation, and told me family isn't only defined by blood. Walking down that aisle on the arm of a man I'd known 3 weeks wasn't the moment I'd pictured a year earlier. It became something else. Something real. I smiled the whole way down, not the practiced smile brides are taught to hold, but a genuine one. Because for the first time in years, I felt surrounded by people who actually wanted to be there. My best friend caught the walk-on video, planning to post it as a small highlight for our friends. Neither of us expected what happened next. By Monday, the clip had crossed 1 million views, comments flooding in from strangers who'd pieced the story together from the caption alone. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. My mother called 61 times that day, each voicemail more frantic than the last, until the final one arrived with the detail that changed everything. Her voice was shaking as she said my father's boss had seen the video, recognized the man walking me down the aisle immediately, and needed to see my father in his office first thing in the morning, because he knew exactly who Julian Thorne really was. I sat up straight and listened to that voicemail 3 more times to be sure I'd understood. Julian wasn't simply a landscape architect hired for a temporary restoration. He was the founder of Thorne Horticultural Group, a company that had quietly acquired the largest commercial landscaping contracts in the state, including the multi-year account tied to the corporate campus where my father had worked for 11 years. My father's boss, Gerald Wickham, sat on the board that had personally approved that contract renewal and had met Julian face-to-face at the signing. When the video crossed his desk, he didn't need context. He recognized him instantly, and the sight of one of the company's most valuable partners standing in for a father who had abandoned his own daughter on her wedding day wasn't something he could scroll past. Gerald called my father in first thing Monday. According to my father's own panicked retelling later that week, the meeting was brutal. Gerald asked bluntly why a respected partner had been standing in for him at his daughter's wedding, and my father stammered through an excuse about a family emergency involving my brother. Gerald reportedly cut him off, said he didn't appreciate being lied to, and that he found it difficult to trust the judgment of a man who would abandon his own child for something as replaceable as an airport departure. My father's standing there had never been untouchable, and this became the excuse leadership needed to sideline him from the promotion he'd been chasing for over a year. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it, only a hollow confirmation that the people I'd spent my whole life trying to please had built their world on the same conditional love they'd shown me since childhood, and now it was collapsing under its own weight. My mother's calls didn't stop. She insisted I post something publicly, clarifying it was all a misunderstanding, that of course they loved me, that Desmond's trip had simply been unavoidable, that I was blowing things out of proportion. I let every call go to voicemail for 4 days, while Rowan and I were on our honeymoon in the mountains, finally away from the noise. When I did call her back, I kept my voice level and told her I wasn't interested in managing her image. Choosing Desmond's flight over my wedding wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision, and decisions have consequences whether or not the internet happens to notice. She cried. She argued. She brought up every sacrifice she claimed to have made raising me. I let her finish, then told her calmly that I hoped she and Dad could figure out how to rebuild whatever they'd damaged at his job, but that it had nothing to do with me anymore. Julian and I stayed in touch, and what started as a favor between near strangers became a real friendship. Over coffee a few weeks later, he told me he'd lost his own daughter to a car accident 6 years earlier, and that walking me down that aisle had given him something he thought he'd never feel again. He said watching my parents' absence with his own eyes had made him angry in a way that surprised him, because he knew firsthand what it meant to lose the chance to walk a daughter down an aisle, and he couldn't understand two people choosing to give that chance away voluntarily. Rowan and I started having him over for dinner regularly, and he slowly became the kind of steady presence my own parents had never managed to be. Desmond, for what it's worth, reached out months later, awkward and apologetic. He hadn't asked our parents to skip my wedding, and felt sick when he found out what they'd done in his name. I believed him, and slowly we've started rebuilding something separate from our parents' dysfunction, something that doesn't require either of us to compete for scraps of attention anymore. Looking back, I wouldn't change a single detail of that day, even the parts that broke my heart at the time, because everything that followed taught me more about who truly shows up for people than 3 decades of trying to earn my parents' approval ever did.